Hi, it's Matthew Reed here with another Reed Repairs video. And today we've got a box chronometer, or a marine chronometer if you like. And I've been looking for one of these instruments for some time for this channel to go through the disassembly, cleaning and reassembly process. Now, the instrument we have here is a relatively modern one, dating from the 1960s. Yet it contains pretty much all the ingredients, if you like, that we want from our marine chronometer. So I hope you like it. As if you do, please comment. It's always great to see what you have to say about these videos and your experiences. Like, subscribe, and remember, if you find the content particularly compelling or useful or interesting, then there's always super thanks. That makes a big difference. So we will see you at the end of the video. So here we have our chronometer. It's a 2-day or 56-hour machine, which is by Glashutte Uhrenmuseum, which is Glashutte Watch Factory. Today the archival records, as we will see later in the video, are in the possession of the Deutsches Uhrenmuseum at Glashutte, and the company, in a slightly different form, are still on the go, and the whole thing has been part of the Nicolas Hyek swatch group since 2000. We can also see that the instrument was retailed by Ludolf, who I presume were kind of ship's chandlers. The machine comes with an amount of documentation, and this is one of the great things about marine chronometers, is that they typically, almost always, have a serial number. The serial number can, in the case of Admiralty machines, lead us to Admiralty records, and in this case it led us to the archive of Glashutte, but also the chronometer comes with a couple of bits of documentation which are great fun. The first one I don't actually think is anything to do with this particular machine. It's an invoice for servicing a chronometer. But then we see this document from Noblish for cleaning and servicing this chronometer. And here is where the serial number comes in, because we can clearly see it's the same machine. It's number 8408. And on the 24th of July 74, the chronometer was cleaned, basically. And importantly, and we'll come back to this later, what we see is at that time it has a daily rate of minus 0.6 of a second. Also with the chronometer is a day book, again from Ludolf, which shows us that this chronometer was used commercially on a merchant ship. I think it was transporting vegetable oil down the river Elbe and into the North Sea, and then from what I can understand, to the English Channel and ports beyond that. And this journey was made many times, and those journeys are recorded in this little book. And that is, as I said, one of the great joys of chronometers, because they have serial numbers and they were used for quote-unquote real work. You can sometimes find their history. With this being a slightly later machine, it follows on the tradition of marine chronometry, which was really established in this way in the early 19th century. So we've got things like these brass drop handles. What you can see is that the brass work on the case is finished in a painted finish, which of course isn't traditional. It would have originally been shellac lacquered polished brass. So there are some concessions made to modernity, if you like. It has a two-layer box, and again, this is interesting because you often see earlier chronometers that had a three-layer box. They had a solid top layer, where the top layer is removed, and the reason that the top layer is removed is because it was a bit of a pain in the chart room or wherever the chronometer was to constantly open the top. If you take that off, you can just peer in the top through the glass and see what time it is. So obviously, sometime in the middle of the 20th century, manufacturers decided to do away with that solid top altogether. We have a typical chronometer ratcheting key, a winding key, again in the same kind of painted brass finish. And of course, as is traditional, the movement is gimbaled. So it's in this kind of two-way leveling mechanism called a gimbal, which keeps the movement level irrespective of the attitude of the vessel within reason. We've got a gimbal lock in the corner of the case, and then the movement is within a bowl with a threaded glazed bezel. As I say, all this was really established in the early part of the 19th century, and very, very little changed in the kind of design of this part of the machine. When we remove the threaded bezel, there's always quite a fine thread here, and in this case the thread is corroded, so we will deal with that. There's the addition of a plastic or kind of textile gasket, which is interesting, again, sort of modern improvement, if you like. When we remove the bezel, we can see that there's some damage to the dial. Tools are being used in removing the hands or attempting to remove the hands, which have changed or damaged the dead flat silvering. Now, I am not going to do masses with this. There really isn't a lot you can do short of completely refinishing it, which I don't want to do. But there are a couple of issues here included, a bent hour hand and a bent subsidiary seconds hand. So the dial layout is totally straightforward. If you haven't seen a chronometer before, you've basically got typically gold hands, minute and hour hands in the center. Below the center, you've got this large and well-defined subsidiary seconds dial. The balance will beat half seconds, so the seconds hand will appear to jump in half-second increments. And then above the center, you've got the what they call the up and down work, or the state of wind. And I think in modern watches this is called power reserve or something. But anyway, we'll call it up and down work. And you can see that the dial is graduated up to 56. So that's 56 hours, or 2 days if you like, plus a little bit. And the machine was wound every day. So you had a day, it was a daily routine to wind it, but you had a day in reserve if something happened or you forgot, or something to that effect. So that's the kind of broad dial layout. Now let's just have a look at the rest of the bowl. So when we turn the bowl over, we can see again the serial number stamped on the shutter, and this painted finish, which is really important in its own right because it is a thing of this period. The shutter rotates in order to insert the winding key, and is sprung as well. So we're going to use the key just to gently push out the movement. So we see broadly that our movement is intact. It's a bit dirty, and really the main thing about from a kind of conservation or cleaning perspective is that the movement is heavily fingerprinted, And if there were ever a case for wearing gloves when handling metal objects like this, then here you have it. So we'll try and do something with that fingerprinting, but because of the incredibly delicate and subtle surface texture of any clock, but in particular these marine chronometers, there is very little you can do in terms of refinishing. So we have to shrug our shoulders and live with the fingerprinting to a degree. Taking a closer look at the bezel, we can see that there's some corrosion between the glass and the bezel, and as I said, the thread is also corroded, making the bezel difficult to fit and remove. So we're going to clean that up a little bit. So what I like to do is to deal with the box or the case of a clock, and the kind of peripherals like the winding key and the pendulum. It doesn't have a pendulum obviously in this case first. So when you've got the movement cleaned, it's ready to go back into a clean box. Otherwise, what tends to happen is the movement hangs around on the bench on test, or you're tempted to put it back into a dusty box, which of course is problematic. So there's a useful little hinge pin here, and we can remove the top layer of the box, and we can begin the disassembly of the gimbal and bowl. I'm going to remove all the parts of the gimbal and wash them in paraffin or kerosene or something oil-based like that. And I'll work at the corrosion with pegwood, and in some cases with a small amount of 4/0 steel wool. I'll put a link in the description. But I'm very mindful that we just need to basically wash these components, remove a little bit of corrosion. I don't want to do any refinishing. As I said, we have this painted finish, which is in its own way quite fragile, and I want to preserve the overall look of the thing. So with the bowl and the gimbal in bits, Again, we can review this kind of corrosion, a few losses to paint, and again, more examples of fingerprinting, some corrosion to the screws and so on. So the process for everything is the same. As I said, I wash it, and where there is corrosion, sort of three-dimensional stuff, I'll approach that with some 4-0 steel wool soaked in microcrystalline wax and just kind of gently, or relatively gently, work at that until I reach a state where there's very little of the three-dimensional corrosion remaining. I work in the threads of the bezel with a natural bristle brush, which has gotten shortened bristles to make it quite stiff, and then clean the whole thing with a number 2 Glasgow brush and finish it in microcrystalline wax. Once all the cleaning is done, it's time to reassemble, and then of course before the gimbal and the ball go back into the box, really important to vacuum everything out, which is really satisfying. Now we've done that, I want to get the glass out of the bezel in order to clean the recess in which the glass fits, get rid of a bit of that corrosion again, and also to clean out the threads. So the glass isn't glued into the bezel, but it's shrunk in with heat, which is obviously a little bit challenging in removing it. If I had a hot plate, that would be great, but I don't. So I'm just going to use a heat gun and very slowly bring the temperature of the bezel and glass up to the degree that the bezel has expanded more than the glass, which it will, and eventually the glass should pop out. Once that's happened, we can clean the recess into which the glass fits and clean up the threads and test it on the cleaned bowl, and find now that it's much easier to refit the bezel. Refitting the glass is exactly the same operation, the reverse. You heat up the bezel only, and because the glass isn't expanding, it's actually easier to get the glass back in than it was to remove it in the first place. So with our gimbal, bowl and case and glass cleaned, we can turn our attention to the hands and the dial. So we noted already that the hour hand and the seconds hand are bent, so we'll have to deal with that. But before we get the hands off, I just want to deal with the most vulnerable part of the movement. I could take the hands and the dial off first, but I think it's, for me, as a relative novice with this kind of stuff, it's better to make the escapement safe. Now, there's an almost mythical kind of fear with marine chronometers with detent escapements that you can easily damage the escapement, and that is absolutely true. We'll see a little bit later on that there's a thing called the locking stone on the detent, which locks the escape wheel between phases of impulse, and that little stone, which is typically ruby or corundum or some synthetic material in these modern machines, is really easy to break and difficult to replace. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tie up the power. Now the clock, the instrument's completely run down, but remember this is a Fusee driven clock, so there's still setup on the mainspring. I've got other videos about Fusee clocks, again I'll put links to those in the description below. And there's Harrison's maintaining power, which is an auxiliary spring inside the Fusee that keeps the clock running when it's being wound. So you have to make sure that all the power is off the train before you remove the escapement. And we're going to be super careful by tying up the fourth wheel to one of the pillars. So whatever happens, the train cannot run through. Once I've done that, I let down the setup on the mainspring. Now you will notice that this clock is as I said, it's a Fusee driven instrument, and it doesn't have a Fusee chain. It has this ribbon of steel. Again, this is one of the few kind of concessions. I don't quite know what to think about it. I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments. But unlike a chain, which is a tricky thing in its own right, this ribbon has a mind of its own. So we've got to be a little bit careful with that. So we let the power off the setup off the mainspring and get the setup winding ratchet off. Sorry, get the setup ratchet off as well. So we know there's no power at all on the mainspring. We can then let the power off the maintaining power. So this is the auxiliary spring inside the Fusee. And then we can lift out the balance. As you can see, one end of the balance spring is retained in a stud, which is screwed to the balance cock. Now obviously we're looking at the movement upside down here from its normal kind of operating state. So what we see here would normally be the bottom pivot for the balance. So we remove the screw for the stud, and then we remove the cock, and then we can remove the balance with its balance spring. We'll come back to that later. Once the balance is out, and remember the train is tied up so it cannot run through, we can remove the barrel bridge. Again, everything's numbered and really beautifully made. I mean, considering this is a relatively modern machine, the concessions to quality are very few. High quality and beautifully finished. And here we can see the detent through the hole in the plate, and we can remove the hands. I could take the detent out now, not really sure about the order of work here, but we've got all the power off and we've got the balance out of the way and the train is tied up. And when I come to remove the subsidiary seconds hand, I find it is incredibly tight on the extended pivot there of the fourth wheel. So we've got a bit of a problem. I lever as hard as I dare, but I worry about breaking the pivot off or damaging a jewel or something. So I'm going to have to approach that in a slightly different way. So with the dial in place still, I do decide to remove the detent, and that comes away as one piece on its foot. And maybe that's a useful time to talk about the detent escapement. So this is the thing that makes a chronometer a chronometer. We'll discuss a bit at the end of the video about the other definition of chronometer, but this definition that was established at the end of the 18th century and ran right through to the Second World War and beyond is defined because of the mechanism. A chronometer has a chronometer escapement, and this thing is called a spring detent, and this is how it works. So here we have our spring detent escapement, a sketch of. So we've got the axis of the balance staff. We've got a small roller with a discharging pallet. We've got the large roller with the impulse pallet or impulse stone. And then we've got the escape wheel, and this is the normal direction of rotation. Here's the detent with the detent spring at the bottom here, and fitted to the detent is the locking stone, which we've already seen, and then the gold spring or passing spring, which is also screwed to the detent. So what happens is that, as I said, the escape wheel is locked on the locking stone here by the force from the mainspring. But with the balance rotating in this direction, then the discharging pallet touches on the gold spring and pushes the detent out of the way to the degree that the locking stone slides off the locked escape wheel tooth. This allows this incoming escape wheel tooth to touch on the impulse jewel, impulsing the balance. Once that phase has happened and the escape wheel slides off the impulse jewel, the detent has sprung back into position, this is what the point of the spring, and the locking jewel is once again in the path of the incoming escape wheel tooth, and the whole thing starts again. When the balance is rotating in the opposite direction, then the discharging pallet can pass the gold spring, which is also called the passing spring, without affecting the locking, without moving the detent. Therefore, the nothing happens in this phase, and you only get impulse or interaction between the train and the escapement in one direction, which is why it's called a detached escapement. So with the detent out of the way, we turn our attention back to our seconds hand. And in the meantime, the thinking time, I've decided that the only reasonable way that I can think of, having soaked the pivot in penetrating oil, is to actually cut away the little pipe or collet on which the subsidiary seconds hand fits. So that's what I do. I use a roller sink cutter, cut away the top of the little pipe or the collet, and the hand then pops off. Which enables us to remove the screws that are retaining the dial to the brass edge, and we can lift the dial away. We see yet again that the back of the dial is fingerprinted. Looking at our under dial work, or motion work I suppose you would call it, we've got a regular arrangement of a 12-to-1 ratio between the minute hand and the hour hand, but we've got the addition above that of this wheel, which is the wheel for the up and down work. So this engages with the pinion, which is fitted to the end of the Fusee arbor, so that wheel sort of reciprocates as the clock runs down and is rewound. We will remove our cannon pinion, and kind of like a watch, in fact exactly like a modern wristwatch, there's a sort of back slope or a groove in the center arbor onto which the cannon pinion clicks, and that forms our friction work. So that is the clutch between the operation of the chronometer, the train, and the position of the hands. So with our dial, hands, motion work, detent, and balance out of the way, we can remove the mainframe from the brass edge, which is an incredibly tight fit on this particular instrument. So the brass edge is a turned piece of material found on chronometers and watches, as in pocket watches, that fits between the dial and the gimbal, that fits between the dial and the ball and the movement. Here is the pinion that's a push fit onto the end of the Fusee arbor. This is the pinion that drives the up and down work. And then we can remove what remains of our modified subsidiary seconds pipe. Next up is to unscrew and remove the Potton's plate. And then we can lift out the train. We've got our escape wheel, centre wheel, third wheel, and fourth wheel. The shroud for the winding arbor is just pushed on. I could have removed that earlier. And then we can unscrew and lift out the maintaining power detent spring. Another concession to the more modern age, and related to that ribbon on the Fusee rather than a chain or a line in clockwork, is that the stop work has to be altered as well. So a Fusee clock, and again please take a look at the other videos on Fusee clocks. So a Fusee clock, or a chronometer in this case, has gotten stop work, so there is an up and down limitation to how much it can be wound, and that in this case is achieved through this little star wheel and a spring, and through a pin driven into the face of the Fusee body here, and that allows the fusee to only rotate so many rotations from right down to wound fully. When we look at our fusee, which again is beautifully made, irrespective of this being quite a modern machine, I couldn't really get over how nicely done it was at this relatively late age. But anyway, we can see that there are Harrison's maintaining power. So Harrison's maintaining power is an auxiliary spring. The system was invented by John Harrison within the fusee that keeps the machine running for the few seconds or a couple of minutes that you are winding it. Normally, action or reaction between the great wheel and the body of the fusee would push the train backwards, and obviously with a precision instrument like this, you don't want that. In fact, that's the last thing you want for all sorts of reasons. And so the clock is kept running by the maintaining power when it's being wound. Here's our center wheel. And cannon pinion. That's our clutch. Our third wheel. Our fourth wheel, onto which the subsidiary seconds hand fits. And then, of course, our escape wheel with 15 teeth. And there we are. We've pretty much got the kind of main components in bits. And it's time to begin on our frame. So as we already mentioned, the frame is heavily fingerprinted, and like most of these machines, most of the bearings are removable, as in they're in screwed chatons. So the jewels are set within a little piece of material, brass or gold sometimes, and they in turn are screwed into the frame. So very high quality work. And this extends to the Fusee arbor bearing, which is retained by 3 screws. The chatons, or settings for the jewels, are dot marked, so in principle you should at least try and put them back in the same place or in the same orientation that they started. So let's begin by removing the jewels from the balance cock. So some of the jewels are a single pierced jewel through which the arbor or the pivot fits. In this case, you've got, like in a watch balance, you've got a pierced jewel and you've got an end stone as well. So there are 2 completely separate elements to this bearing. and we can see them there, the pierce jewel and the end stone, and we can see that the oil is green and the clock is overdue cleaning. Just push the jewel out with a piece of pegwood, gently working it out of the balance cock. In order to try and minimize the appearance of the fingerprinting, there's nothing I can really do beyond just cleaning the components in some commercially available watch cleaning solution, and I'll put a link in the description below. So in kind of conservation mode, we just work at it pretty gently with the clock cleaning solution. Normally I wouldn't use any brightening type of agent, but I think there is a little bit of a compromise to be had here. And you can see on the balance cock, once I've cleaned it and rinsed it without any polishing or very minimal chemical refinishing, you can still see the fingerprints. There's nothing I can do about that. They're etched into the surface, but the kind of contrast has been reduced, so I hope they're a little bit easier on the eye. And to be honest, there's also, what's done is done. I can't really legislate for things like that, so we're kind of here to observe and get the clock back into reasonable functioning condition. For a change of scene, let's have a look at the Fusee now. So the great wheel has got this collet or end piece, I don't know quite what you would call it, made out of steel, which is pinned on. So we get the pin out, and then we can remove the retaining piece, and when we remove the great wheel, we see that there's quite a lot of old oil in there. Remove the Harrison's maintaining power ratchet wheel, and the great wheel assembly, or the Fusee assembly, has got 2 ratchet clicks. So again, sign of quality, and everything is really beautifully finished, down to the fact that the click springs are screwed on with 2 little screws. It's really really nicely done and a pleasure to work on. And then we've got our Harrison's maintaining spring on the great wheel, and it's this spring, this piece of steel, that keeps the instrument running when it's been wound. So we can remove the maintaining power spring from the great wheel, just have a little check that everything else is in order, and as we move towards cleaning that, we can move on to our mainspring barrel. So having popped off the barrel cap, again we can see the oil has passed its sell-by date, and we can remove the barrel arbor from the mainspring. Now the steel pivots and components like this barrel arbor may appear to be chrome plated, like some modern clocks, but they're not. They're just incredibly highly polished steel. Really great work. And then, in no particular order, we can continue with the disassembly of the movement, taking out all the jewels, making sure we try not to get things mixed up, as we sort of noting any sort of idiosyncrasies or damage or previous repairs as we go along. With everything washed in the same manner, rinsed and dried, we can begin to slowly put the thing back together again, or at least the movement frame. Didn't really want it hanging around in bits while I was working on the other components, so sort of paranoia got the best of me. We peg out all the bearings, even though they've just already been cleaned, and then we can begin to refit the jewels. Now it's time to pop the Fusee bearing back in, making sure it's nicely seated before returning the 3 steel screws. We'll now turn our attention to the potence plate, so the other part of the movement frame. We've got the same sort of issues with old oil and jewels that have to be removed, and of course our work for the Fusee stop work. jumping around slightly to keep ourselves entertained. Once we get the mainspring out, we can see that it's signed, and which is very typical of marine chronometers. Quite a few French clocks, continental clocks have signed mainsprings, so it's always nice to look out for that, particularly if you're tempted to replace a spring. Maybe it's a good reason to retain a spring if it's not broken. And it's signed J.N. Eberle. And I was really delighted to learn that this company is still going. So their earlier history in making clock springs has now extended to a kind of multinational company that still makes springs, but do all sorts of high quality metal fabrication and production. So really heartening to see that this spring company is still in business in Germany. So let's turn our attention to getting the balance in bits and cleaning that too. Quick tour of the chronometer balance. So as you can see, if you're familiar with a watch or a modern watch, you will have seen the balance has a balance spring, which is the restoring force. But in this case, the spring is helical in form with two terminal curves. So as I understand it, the terminal curves in this form and the helical spring were developed by John Arnold at the end of the 18th century. So the terminal curves are for isochronism, so the balance in theory beats equal time irrespective or relatively of amplitude. So the balance itself comprises steel and brass fused together, and this is the way that the machine compensates for changes in temperature. So to understand our compensation balance, let's just look at a simple bimetallic strip. So this is a piece of steel and a piece of brass that are either riveted or soldered, or in this case, fused together. Now, because brass expands more than steel, in heat, the bimetallic strip will deflect at one end if the other end is fixed in this direction. In cold, it will deflect in the other direction, and this can be used in our balance. When we look at our balance, what we see in fact is the balance rim is formed of two curved bimetallic strips, and exactly the same theory applies. So we've got weights on the balance arms, compensation weights, or to give mass to the balance, and these weights can be moved up and down the rim to change the amount of compensation. So in heat, when the balance spring is less elastic and has less restoring force, the balance rims with their weights move in. So here's our balance, and you can see that it comprises of two curved bimetallic strips, or limbs. They start off as one complete circle and then they are cut, hence the name cut balance in a watch. So exactly the same theory applies, that in heat the limbs of the balance rim move towards the axis, reducing the moment of inertia, which compensates for the change in elasticity of the balance spring. In heat, the spring becomes less elastic and therefore it's got less restoring force. And the opposite happens in cold. The limbs of the rim relatively move outwards, which again compensate for the change in elasticity of the balance spring. In cold, the spring becomes more elastic, it has more restoring force, and therefore by the limbs of the balance rim moving outwards, you have a greater moment of inertia. Now, it's known that these two things don't completely balance each other out, but that is a story that's well beyond the scope of this video. The balance has got two sets of weights. It's got meantime weights, which are the ones at the ends of the arms, and you screw those in and out again to adjust the moment of inertia of the balance and make the instrument run faster or slower. The other weights, the balance weights, are there to give it mass, but they're situated a specific distance from or to the ends of the arms, and this adjusts the amount of compensation. So the closer towards the end of the arms, the cut ends, then the more compensation you get, and vice versa. So it's a good idea, even though this chronometer isn't going to be used in anger again, as it were, to kind of put the weights back in the same position. With the balance disassembled, we can get a closer look again at how beautifully made it is, and that lamina of the brass and steel together. The balance staff, as described earlier, has got two jewels on it. One is the unlocking or discharging jewel, the small one, and the larger one is the impulse jewel. So the small jewel passes the gold spring in one direction like a switch, nothing happens. In the other direction, it unlocks the train, tooth of the escape wheel lands on the larger diameter impulse jewel, the balance gets an impulse, and then the whole thing is locked again. With the balance washed, it's time to get everything fitted back together. Again, slightly paranoid with an instrument like this that things are going to get lost or I'm going to forget exactly where every screw goes. And with the balance reassembled and the spring refitted, we can turn our attention to the detent and cleaning that. As I said before, the detent has got this very fine ruby locking jewel, which is incredibly easily damaged, as is the detent itself, because it's a very thin spring. You'll notice in the reflections that the spring is already very slightly kinked, but I don't think that'll affect the operation of the escapement. So once the detent's off its block, we can remove the gold spring or passing spring, and we can wash the whole thing and reassemble. So with pretty much the movement taken apart, washed and mostly reassembled, I'll now begin to look at the hands and the dial. I could have done these earlier. The hands, again, like the other parts of the movement, are fingerprinted, so they've got some surface corrosion. The minute hand and hour hands are a bit bent, and of course the seconds hand is bent too. So I use a pair of brass and then a pair of plastic tweezers to straighten up the hands, because obviously I don't want to scratch them. And then I use a cream of tartar and a natural bristle brush to very gently kind of polish, if you like, or abrade the hands in order to remove some of that corrosion. Again, I don't want them to be shiny, I don't want them to look like new, but I do want to kind of moderate the overall appearance. Same applies for the dial. So originally this dial had all over dead matte silvering, which is fragile. You're not really meant to touch the dial. You don't need to touch the dial because the winding key has on the bow end a small square on it for adjusting the hands, for moving the hands. So, however, the dial has gotten a bit of change, if you like, or damage through levering off the hands at some point, and it's fingerprinted. So again, I'm going to use cream of tartar to try and remove or moderate some of the corrosion, and just to try and lift the whole thing a little bit to make it look a little bit more coherent. So I use natural bristle brushes, and I keep checking as I'm going along that to the degree that we do this kind of operation, because the cream of tartar is slightly abrasive, so I do not want the whole thing to become polished looking. And after rinsing and rinsing again in deionized water, yes, we've still got the evidence of some fingerprinting on the back, but the three-dimensional nature of that has, to a degree, disappeared. And then on the front, again, we've still got those burnished areas, but the overall appearance of the dial, I hope you agree, maybe not, has been sort of improved, and I use that term advisedly, to the degree that the whole thing will appear a little bit more sort of coherent. Time to straighten the subsidiary seconds hand. Use my brass tweezers for this, and measure up the pivot, and we can make a new collet. And I do this by first putting the old pipe or collet onto a clockmaker's brooch and marking the position, which will give us our approximate diameter. And then I take a piece of bushing wire, drill that out to just under size, turn on a seat for the hand, rivet the hand in place, and then slowly open up the inner diameter of the new pipe until it fits on the extended pivot of the fourth wheel to about the correct height. We can make small adjustments later. going to put some liquid spray grease with molybdenum on my mainspring, link in the description below. Bit of Mobius D5 on the barrel pivots, and it's time to begin our final reassembly. Throughout the machine, I'm using D5 and D3 until I get to the jeweled train wheels, and then I'm using Mobius 9020, which is a kind of watch oil, and I'm using a bit of D3 or D4 on the lower balance pivots. It's quite heavily loaded there. So working on the maintaining power assembly, we will refix the springs, and the clicks, for winding, lubricate as we go. and refit the steel retaining piece. I refit the stopwork. Deliberate mistake. I fit the spring upside down to begin with, and of course it doesn't work, so I've got to take it off and redo it. So there's our what will be the upper pivot for the balance in its cock or pottons, reassembled and lubricated. And then pop the train in. So beginning with our third wheel, followed by our center wheel, followed by our fusee, followed by our fourth wheel, and then our escape wheel. And don't forget, before you put the plate on, to replace the maintaining power detent. The number of clocks that we've reassembled and forgotten that part. I'll take it apart again. I did make another mistake here, that I used the wrong screw for the pottons, and I had to take it apart anyway. So again, you can't be too careful when just checking the lengths of those threads, because it's easy to make some damage there. Didn't in this case, but it was just a bit embarrassing to have to disassemble it to put the right screw in the right place. We can put the train jewels in as we go. Again, lubricating, checking that everything is perfectly free. Checking that the stop work works correctly. Then I can refit the barrel assembly. time to put the detent back in. There's no power at all on the mainspring at the moment because the strip of steel that connects the barrel and the fusee is not yet fitted. Just to check now the depth of the engagement of the escape wheel teeth and the locking stone on the detent. There's a screw to change the adjustment there, and as I understand it, the engagement there should be about a third, so the escape wheel tooth should be about a third of the way onto the locking jaw. And checking that the action is nice and snappy. So refitting the ribbon, the steel ribbon that connects the barrel and the fusee, was took me at least three goes. I think it was a little bit of something I had to kind of learn, a bit different from fusee clock with a chain, but gotten there in the end. And I think that's just one of those situations where you really don't need to be in a rush. You just need to be nice and patient, so nothing gets damaged. And as we begin to assemble the under dial work, the up and down work, checking and checking again that everything has gotten lubricated. The jewels back in the balance cock. Pop the balance back in, check that it's not binding on anything, refit the balance cock, refit the stud, have a quick check around that everything's nice and free and everything's buttoned up, and then it's time to give it a little bit of a tentative wind. just checking the action of the locking. The action of the stopwork, and then we can begin to put a little bit more tension on the mainspring as the instrument gets up to full amplitude. Can refit the motion work, the minute wheel, the hour wheel, and the wheel for the up and down work. Then our dial goes back on. A little bit of adjustment to the seconds hand, opening up that pipe with a brooch until it fits nicely. Refit the hands, and then we can see how it begins to run. Last but not least is to vacuum out the guard box. Now, I think the guard box is the right one for this chronometer. They often get mixed up, don't know, but presume it is. It's quite a good fit. However, the top of it is missing for the same reason that I explained earlier, that constantly undoing the guard box is a bit of a pain. So what tends to happen is the top half gets removed. The guard box, which is a protective box, gets screwed down to a table in the vessel so it can't slew about, and then for whatever reason the top of the guard box never gets screwed on again, so it becomes permanently lost. But there you go, it seems to be working fine. So before we sign off, a couple of things about this video that might warrant a bit more explanation. And the first is to do with timekeeping. Now, I know many of you watch videos or make videos about modern wristwatches, and there's a lot of talk about accuracy. And in the 18th century, when marine chronometers and earlier marine timekeepers were being developed, that term wasn't a big deal as such. What they were interested in, and we still are today, is stability. So you want your timekeeper or timepiece or chronometer or whatever you want to call it to keep the same rate irrespective of temperature change, and with a watch positional error as well, not such a big deal with a marine chronometer, over time, with changes in the lubrication and so on. So stability is where it's at. And as an example of that, if you've got a machine that keeps time to, say, plus 20 seconds a day, but it's always 20 seconds fast of mean time or sidereal time or whatever your base standard is, it doesn't matter as long as you know, because when you do your calculations, you can just deduct 20 seconds a day. Whereas a machine that appears to indicate accurate time over a period of time, if you don't know anything about the stability, it might be gaining 20 seconds one day, it might slowly begin to lose, and then it's losing 10 seconds, and it's gaining 5, and you get the picture. It's not stable. So I just thought I'd just talk about that, about these issues of rate, which is the thing that you declare that your chronometer is rated to plus 1.5 seconds a day or something. Stability, which is the real important thing. And then this idea that we hear a lot on YouTube about accuracy. The second thing I wanted to talk about is what is a chronometer? Now, we've seen what a chronometer in this context is, because it has a chronometer escapement. In this case, a spring detent escapement, could be other types of chronometer escapement, typically including the pivoted detent. And that's what defined what a chronometer was. If we look at the work of John Harrison, for instance, his machines were not called chronometers in the contemporary way. They didn't have chronometer escapements. H4 has a verge escapement, for instance. It was really only with the development of these machines by those people that we heard about, by John Arnold and Thomas Earnshaw, that we get this definition of a chronometer, which is something to do with the mechanism. It has a chronometer escapement. Whereas if you buy a modern watch and that says chronometer on the dial, with very few exceptions, and there are some exceptions, that watch will have a lever escapement, which is not a chronometer escapement. So that word chronometer, which is perfectly valid, means a totally different thing. It is, in fact, something to do with an agreed set of timekeeping standards that will be issued by some issuing authority that agree those standards. So this quartz watch can reasonably be termed a chronometer if you want to pay for it to be tested and have it put through those tests. So my point is just one of interest that those two definitions are overlapping but different things. One is a mechanism, one is a set of timekeeping standards. So there you go. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Please do remember to like, subscribe and comment. I always try and get through the comments if I can and respond. And importantly, if you found the content particularly endearing or useful, then there's always super thanks, and I really appreciate that because it keeps the thing moving. So thank you very much, and we will see you again soon. As a postscript, you might like to know that the archive for Glashutte Uhrenmuseum still exists, and it's held at the Deutsches Uhrenmuseum in Glashutte. I was delighted to discover that you could apply for an abstract from the archive, and I did that. I applied to the archivist. There is, of course, a fee, and they sent me this folder with a page from the ledger showing that our machine, number 8408, was delivered on the 30th of May 1963, and it was sold on the 6th of June that same year. So my special thanks to the archivist.